Thank you so much to Kai. Thank you, Akim. Thank you, Maya. What amazing set of words. It's such an honor. And I should also apologize for the background. I have just moved, so you just see boxes behind me, but at least I'm not inside a box, which literally from this morning I felt like I was. Your words are really touching also because I feel like they're very surgical. They really go to the core of what I believe, and obviously what you believe, what I think the world needs, which is a very different understanding of the economy. And, you know, Adam Smith was such a big thinker, and he's probably the least understood of thinkers, not only for what you have all already said, which is, you know, he was not actually about the free market. He had such a complex understanding. He was really the founder in some ways of our understanding of the division of labor, the key sources that lead to productivity increases in terms of organizational change, technological change, but also very much in terms of how to steer the system. You know, one of the most misunderstood aspects of Adam Smith is this concept of the free market. What he actually meant was free from rent, not free from the state. And to, you know, lower the amount of rent extraction in the system and to really steer the system towards value creation, we need very different types of actors, a very different type of state, very different types of business, less extractive, but also a very different type of relationship, something I've recently been calling a more symbiotic, a more mutualistic relationship between business and the state, and less of what I see, for example, in the healthcare sector, health innovation sector, which is often a parasitic relationship between public and private. And also, I think, you know, his work was very much in tandem, how do you say, complementary to the work of people like Karl Polanyi, the Austro-Hungarian economist, historian, sociologist, who really saw markets as outcomes. And, you know, Maya said this very well, markets are not out there as though there's some deterministic force forcing different actors to behave in a different way. They are themselves outcomes of how we govern and organize all the different actors in the economy. You know, the state can be very siloed and see its role as just fixing markets, or it can be an active shaper and co-creator and help steer the system. Businesses can be just focused on short-term profits and maximizing shares, or they can be governed in a way that really maximizes stakeholder value, not just shareholder value. And the design of how we bring together, you know, different public, private, but also third sector actors, that itself is also an outcome of decisions we make, of agency we have in the system. And you know, another, of course, amazing thinker was John Maynard Keynes, who, in a way that I think, you know, people don't understand, was in some ways complementary to Adam Smith. It's not true that Adam Smith said the state go away and Keynes said the state come in. They both actually had, I think, quite an inspirational view of how we should be governing the system. And Keynes is, I think, misunderstood because sometimes, even by modern Keynesians, he's seen as someone who was just about counter-cyclical spending, right? You know, the state must come in when we have too little investment by business, too little consumption by consumers, and recessions stimulate the system so recessions don't lead to depressions. And that's, first of all, a very important point. We shouldn't forget that, you know, since World War II, we've had very few, almost no depressions because of Keynesian economics. Before World War II, if you look at the data, which is always useful to look at sometimes, even just literally plot the data, don't worry about the econometrics, you see that there was constant depressions, literally almost every 10 to 15 years. There was deflation, almost as a persistent phenomena. And only once the state came in to play this counter-cyclical role did we, you know, stabilize output, reduce the number of recessions, but also prevent them from turning into depressions. And, you know, slight inflation, 2-3% is also an outcome of that, instead of having deflation, which can have really dysfunctional consequences. Now, the reason, though, that he's misunderstood is that that's not enough. It's not enough just to come in and patch up the system, inject money in the system when there's too little. He also had this wonderful quote that, the role of government should not just be to make things a bit better, a bit worse, but it should really be doing what's not being done at all. And that's not just about fixing the gap, filling the gap of some missing investment here and there, which economists look at through different notions of market failures that need fixing. It really requires a reimagination in some ways of what's to be done. And the reason I found the work on missions and challenge-oriented thinking is it forces us to reimagine together what's to be done. Since 2015, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, these 17 incredibly ambitious goals. Beneath them, we have 169 targets. And by any indicator that people have been using, you see we're not achieving them. We are nowhere closer to achieving them in many cases. And you might have some blips of improvement in some places, but we are not systematically, coherently, in an aligned global way, taking these sustainable development goals seriously. And so if we bring together these ideas from Smith, including his wonderful work on the theory of moral sentiments, his attention to the division of innovative labor between different actors, his attention to limiting value extraction, the work of Karl Polanyi on steering markets and remembering that the free market has, as Maya so eloquently said, never really existed. The market itself is an outcome of state intervention, and the question is not the market or no market, but what kind of market, and how do we govern systems differently to achieve the market outcomes we need, but also Keynes's work on thinking big. We have to bring all these ideas together. And, dare I say also of many women economists, Kate Raworth's wonderful work on the circular economy, Stephanie Kelton's wonderful work on rethinking where finance comes from and the kind of revealing of the self-imposed false constraints which many countries burden themselves with, the theory of Elinor Ostrom on the common good and the commons, the work of my good friend Carlota Perez, who looks historically at different trajectories and the relationship between finance, the state, and capital, and how we need to govern these relationships in particular ways. I think all these different theorists we're starving today for a better economic theory in order to tackle seriously the biggest challenges that we have, which the SDGs, of course, summarize very well. But let's be very clear right now, on the back of COVID-19 and on the back of the IPCC report, we can even just summarize it as we need more inclusive, healthy, and sustainable growth. And the current status quo of economic theory and economic practice is not getting there. And if you let me keep quoting people, John Maynard Keynes also had this great quote. He said, "Practitioners on the ground who think they're just getting the job done and they don't care about the big theory are actually often slaves of defunct economic theory." And so that constant need to change both theory and practice and reveal the interlinkages between them, that we cannot get better practice without better theory. And theory itself needs to learn on the ground as we try to implement better practice. It's often much messier. It's not a linear process. How do we bring that learning back to the theory itself? And so in 2017, I set up this Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at University College London, precisely in order to delve into this world of better theory, better practice, but to create a link between the two. And we call this practice-based theorizing. And the idea is really to start experimenting, working closely with policymakers from the beginning of our work, instead of doing what, unfortunately, we often do in academia, which is to write our wonderful things, books, articles, whatever, and at the end say, policy implications. Listen to me, I'm so smart. No, we need to be working with practitioners and policymakers at the beginning, being much more humble, listening, having true empathy, which means putting yourself in other people's shoes. And as we try to implement our ideas, whether it be around the sources of patient long-term finance, so setting up a new public wealth fund or public bank, whether it's about having more dynamic procurement policy to really, again, be more oriented around the innovative kinds of solutions that we need to deliver on our social goals, whether it's the design of new types of public-private partnerships, when we're looking at how to design common good features in areas as important as vaccines, we need to bring back the learnings, the learning by doing, the trial and error and error and error back to the theory itself. And one of the main things we try to do in the Institute is we also try to think, what's the new curriculum, literally the new training that global bureaucrats perhaps need in order to govern our system in a different way, in order to have a market co-creation approach, a market shaping approach, and not just a market fixing one. And currently the curriculum that is available out there in the world, whether it's at the Kennedy School or at Oxford University, these come from an idea of the state at best as fixing markets. At worst, the idea is that government failure is even worse than market failure. So take up as little space as possible, fix, the basic problems like basic research, SME financing, carbon taxes, and so on, but then let the value creation itself occur in business. And it comes from public choice theory, new public management, and so on. And so one of the things I think I'm proudest of over the last 2 years is we've started to rewrite the curriculum, and it's based on 4 big pillars that I think are quite useful. And I would love to speak more to Green Budget Germany about this. And if the new administration in Germany is interested, definitely we can run an executive education program for you all. But really, the idea is to unpick 4 aspects. One is value, which was already talked about. What are the underlying assumptions about how value is created that we need to be debunking in order to have a much more explicit value collective creation process? What does it mean to look at the civil service itself as being, as creating value, and what are the skills and capabilities that are required within the state in order to deliver on that? But also, what are the narratives, the stories, the discourse, the vocabulary that we currently use, and how can it be shaped to differently if we actually look at value in a fundamentally different way? The second one is about putting purpose, so the big word is purpose, at the center of policy design. John Kenneth Galbraith wrote about this many years ago, but a purposeful type of policy needs actually to have a very strong concept of the common good at the center. And it's interesting that the public good, that word, often used, sounds good because one of the words is good, but it's actually still just a correction for something that the private sector is not doing. Whereas the common good is something we truly try to achieve together. It's an objective. So what does an outcomes-based, objective-driven, mission-oriented, purposeful policymaking process look like, and how is it different from the current one we have? The third module is on creative bureaucracies. There is no reason why the word bureaucratic should be a negative word. We just have the wrong bureaucracies. And going back to the work of Veblen and others to really unpick this idea that the kinds of sometimes static, inertial, inflexible bureaucracies we have are not because the DNA of the public sector makes it like that, but we've chosen to construct state organizations like that. And it's also correlated to the idea that at best we need fixers, right? What are really the new capabilities, the dynamic capabilities within the public sector that we need to also make states less reliant on the McKinseys of the world, the consulting companies, and so on. And it's not that McKinsey is evil or anything, but if you have some sort of addiction to outsourcing your capabilities, well, you will become stupider and stupider over time. And this is something that NASA, by the way, during the Apollo program was very careful about. When I wrote my recent book, Mission Economy, I uncovered wonderful quotes by people like Ernest Brackett, the head of procurement. He said, unless we ourselves within NASA invest in our brain and our capabilities, we won't even know who to work with. We won't know which private companies to work with. We won't know how to write the terms of reference. So it's such an interesting insight. And he said, we will get captured by brochuremanship. So, at the time they didn't have PowerPoints, they had brochures. And anyway, so really important to rethink our bureaucracies and our organizational structures to be flexible, agile, but really to be embedded with new capacity and capabilities. And we see this, of course, with COVID-19, just the incredibly weak capacity that has been revealed on the ground. I recently wrote a report with UNDP. Achim Steiner and I co-authored it about looking at which places in the world did better during COVID-19. And places like Kerala and Vietnam did much better than some other places on the back of those very investments within their public administrations. And one of the big skills, of course, is how to govern digital platforms in a more proactive way. And this brings me to the fourth module in our curriculum, which is, again, linked to the theory of public value and public purpose, linked to the new practice. And this fourth module is about design thinking. How can we be both long-termist and have planning, but do it with a really dynamic design thinking lens that fosters that continual learning, the feedback processes, which make you also really become actually a learning organization, but also how can we use design thinking for how we govern, for example, digital platforms in order to steer them towards common good type metrics that I mentioned before. That means not just building infrastructure, whether it's digital, physical, social, whatever, but it actually means, again, always starting with the question, what is this for? And then embodying within the design itself, including the design of the algorithms that we currently are using, these very important principles, again, going back to Adam Smith, the theory of moral sentiments, of bringing kind of ethics, morality, and the common good to the center of the design process. Anyway, I don't want to go on for too long, but I do want to say that this notion of missions is, I think, very important right now, because we have globally a period in which a lot of money is going into the system, right? 3 or 4 trillion in the US has come out of the woodwork for the US recovery scheme. In Europe, we have the Next Gen EU recovery scheme, about 2 trillion euros, which is conditional this time, not on cutting deficits as we had after the financial crisis, where we had the big fights between Greece and Germany and so on. This time it's conditional on member states actually having a plan around climate and digitalization. Unfortunately, though, if on the ground the capacity is weak, if on the ground we've forgotten how to implement dynamic industrial strategies, innovation policies that are not captured by particular sectors, but are truly challenge-oriented, if we are not practicing new forms of procurement, new ways to design a financial institution towards our social goals, then this can be really a wasted moment. And so I think we have to always relate back these big ambitions from a recovery program to the much needed changes on what's on the ground in terms of the structures, the institutions, and the tools, so that they really match up. And so it's great, I guess one could say the state is back, but it's not great if we don't actually ask ourselves what kind of state, what kind of public, what kind of remit do our public organizations have to be driven by. I've worked recently with the BBC because they talk a lot about public value within their own organization. What does that look like, public value within any state organization? So getting our hands dirty with these concepts are really important. And the time is now. We can't screw this up again. We've got 8 years left for climate change. We have this pandemic, and surely there will be more pandemics. So we cannot continue to just kind of tinker on the sides of the system. So, a market shaping, a co-creation agenda, getting new tools on the ground, driving new forms of partnerships between public and private. This all requires new theory, new practice, new learning. And I just want to, thank you from the bottom of my heart for giving me this prize, because that's how I see that this honor you've given me is really to, create a dialogue with Germany, with other countries, which is always going back to the idea it's impossible to get better policies unless we have new thinking, and unless the new thinking itself is humble, empathetic, and learns from the trials that we have on the ground. But we have to care. We have to experiment, as Roosevelt himself said. He said, just try something for God's sake. But trying is important, but also learning from the experimentation is important. So thank you so much. I will stop now because I think I've gone over my time limit. But thank you for your words. Thank you for the honor. And I see this, I hope, as a real collaboration with you also for the future around green budgeting, which is a wonderful concept.